Hello, I'm Sarah Barth, Executive Director of Sempervirens Fund. Sempervirens Fund is a nonprofit conservation organization that's focused on the protection and restoration of redwood forests here in California in the Central Coast region in the Santa Cruz Mountains, which, if you're not from California, is just outside Silicon Valley, down to the coast. This is our monthly webinar series, Under the Redwoods, in which we explore the beauty, the history, the science, the artistry, the inspiration of redwoods, really all things redwoods. And we want to thank you for joining us. We also want to thank Sharp Investments. They have been our generous sponsor of this year's Under the Redwoods webinar series. And we want to specifically thank Shepard Mullen, our pro bono attorneys who have provided all kinds of support to Sempervirens, including sponsoring this episode. But let's turn to our speaker for today, Dr. Daniel Lewis. He is really a fascinating fellow. He's got a background in education as a writer, a historian. I learned he's written a book about trees, but he's also a bird nerd. He's a really amazing person. We're very lucky to have him. His day job is the Dibner Senior Curator for the History of Science and Technology at the Huntington. Huntington is this fabulous cultural resource that is a combination library, art museum, and botanical garden. Check it out in SoCal. Worth the visit. Anyway, he is responsible for the science and technology holdings from 1800 to the present at the Huntington. And he also has had postdoc appointments at Oxford, the Smithsonian, and the Rachel Carson Center for the Environment and Society in Munich. So this guy gets around, and he is really, really fascinating. I'll just leave it at that. He also has a faculty appointment at Caltech. So Dr. Lewis is the author of 4 books, but we're here today to talk about this one, his newest book called 12 Trees. I highly recommend it, published recently by Simon & Schuster, and I'm really excited to speak with him about it. So, Dan, welcome to Under the Redwoods.
Sarah, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here.
We're delighted to have you. Maybe let's start with just for the audience, if they haven't had the pleasure of reading your book, maybe give them a brief overview of what it's about, which is admittedly many things, but maybe share with them the concept of the 12 trees.
Sure. Let me just say one of the things that I don't think I've said this in a public forum before, but this book was originally sectioned into 4 parts: air, earth, water, and fire. And so these trees had both a literal or a metaphorical home in one of those categories. I dispensed with that category, but in some ways, those are still through lines throughout the book. And I wanted to have this sort of encapsulation of it through those 4 qualities. And so they're sort of quiet qualities now. But really what I really wanted to talk about, I really wanted to combine science and sensibility to talk about these trees in a way that was accurate scientifically, but that also represented all of the other things that humans bring to the table, as it were, and into the woods. Because, science is not something that is, people think science is impartial. It is to a degree, but in many ways it's not impartial. And it's also true that science is very much driven by desire. And I wanted that to be a through line as well for the book. I probably could have picked any 12 trees. One of the things these trees have in common, though, in a sense, is that there's very little overlap in their ranges geographically. And there's a climate story struck through this book that threads its way in and out of these different trees. And I wanted to show that climate change really is heterogeneous in its effects. There are lots of different flavors to it. There are different ways to understand it over short and long periods of time. And so that was one of the criteria. I'll say one other thing about that. People say, why did you pick these 12 trees? Well, I've come to liken it to thinking about living in a city of, say, 73,000 people, which is how many species of trees we think exist. And then going to a cocktail party, say, where there may be 200 people. And you're there and you're meeting people, and some of them are messy, some of them are quiet or standing in the corner, some of them are you can't miss because they're big and they're brash and they're loud. And I became friends with these trees like that. I had a whole number of possibilities, and I read about them and thought about trees. So I really had things I thought I could say about them that would be useful to a wide audience. And really, in a loose kind of way, that was my metric for how I came to write this book. And really, what it's about in some ways. And there are through lines, you know, a lot of these books really are very much about our relationships with, a lot of these trees are about our relationships with them. So that's
Yeah.
a key component.
Yeah, I mean, this audience obviously is pretty focused on redwoods. And so I was delighted to see that one of your 12 was a redwood. We probably would have interviewed you anyway because we love trees, period. But do you have anything more you can tell us about what stood out to you about redwoods and why they made the short list out of the 73,000?
Well, they're so impressive, and you know, as the tallest carbon-bearing organism in the world, they're spectacular. I think there's
Yeah,
always something to be learned about a tree that stands out like that, beyond the fact that it's iconic, because
yeah,
something has taken place for it to get to that position, whether it's biologically or culturally. And the
yeah,
redwoods really were an easy choice. They were an early selection in my probably year-long interrogation of different trees, as it were. And so they stood out. And you know, they, as I say, you know, they're so spectacular and they're so charismatic. You know, standing next to one is like taking a picture with a president, I say in the book. You
yeah,
know,
yeah,
you're in the presence of something much bigger than yourself. Obviously not just literally, but figuratively as well. So just their grandeur and their immensity, you know, commands attention, I think is probably the way to put it.
yeah. I like that. And I certainly feel that. And I've watched people over the years from all kinds of backgrounds, ages. It doesn't seem to matter. I think there's something about those trees that really speak to people. Um, but it's interesting. To me, it's as much their longevity as it is their size. Of course, those things are somewhat correlated, but
Right.
I always feel so amazed at the fact that I'm in the presence at times of something that's been around for 1,500 years and is going to live much longer than I or probably many of my direct descendants will live, which is sobering and
hmm
humbling.
hmm I mean, I think in some alternate botanical world, if it turned out the coast redwood could get that big but only live for 25 years or something, then it would be a sorrow. There'd be a story of sorrow and grief rather than a
Yeah,
story of sort of elation and celebration, right?
yeah,
And so
yeah,
you're absolutely right, Sarah. The longevity is a key. It's a key factor in the calculus of kind of understanding this tree and our place, you know, among it and around it, as it were.
yeah, yeah. You talk about different trees in this book and relate them to different types of family members,
Mhm.
categories, like a bookish aunt. And I wondered, now you already related a redwood to sort of a presidential feel, but I wonder in the realm of family, how did you think about the redwood?
You know, if I had to sort of personify the redwood, and for some reason I want to characterize him as male, which might not be the way to do it, but I think of the redwood as like your burly uncle, at least for
I
my
think of them as like
characterization.
the grand matriarch. Isn't that
Okay.
funny?
Well, so let me go on with my analogy
Yeah,
here.
tell me your tell me your version.
He's like your burly uncle, right? He's got a big beard, right? You know, he's a little intimidating, but he smells
Yeah,
really good, you know, when you hug him. And you know, he's clearly been through a lot. You know, you can see the
yeah.
long life inscribed on his body, and he moves kind of slowly, except when he needs to move quickly, you know. And so I suppose if I had, you know, at first blush, that's probably how I could probably have a version of that where it was um, a matronly version dressed in a spectacular gown, who also smells really good. And, you know, has a kind of nobility about her, you know, I suppose would be the way to think about it. So
You can keep your image and I can keep mine.
there is room. It's a capacious tent, right?
Right. It's sort of like one of those Rorschach tests that you can just see in it what you wish.
Exactly.
One of the things I especially liked is, the book clearly delves into the history of some of these trees, and as you said, their interactions with humanity. But it's also, the subtitle is The Deep Roots of Our Future, and it's clearly thinking about the future. We're pretty obsessed in this organization with the future longevity of and viability
hmm
of redwood forests, not just individual trees, but really the viability of natural redwood forests in this region and beyond.
hmm
And I'm curious if you feel like you learned any lessons either from your research into redwoods or looking at some of the other trees that you think are things we should be thinking about, Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, I guess I'd call it a testing strategy for trees, that humans can facilitate, So one of these, you can plant it just outside its normal range and see how it does. You can test it in different conditions where it might not naturally occur. Like you wouldn't want to try to plunk it down somewhere in the Antarctic, that'd be a
right,
non-starter. But
right.
one of the examples in the book is the bald cypress and its
Yeah,
relationship to salt water. And so, it's evolved to live in brackish water, but because there's always individual variation, some individuals do better in saltier water than others. And so then it's a case of trying to hybridize or graft or find ways to introduce genetic material that comes from trees that have a different way to survive. And so for the coast redwood, I would imagine that, and this has been done, testing it by trying to find places that it is doing well. And we know, of course, and most of the audience probably knows this, is that, the redwood survives in all sorts of conditions far outside its range. I'm looking out my window right now. There are 200-foot tall redwoods out here. They're puny compared to your Northern California examples, but they're doing pretty well, And in fact, like my wife just picked up a tiny redwood sample, and she was up in Santa Cruz a few weeks ago with one of our kids on a college tour. And she's like, make this into a bonsai. I'm like, I don't want to make it into a bonsai. I want to plant it and see how it grows. So it'll
not, don't
thrive.
put it in your yard.
No, it's in a pot right now. It's
Okay.
I'm going to bring it down to the Huntington at some point. We have probably 10 different coast redwoods growing on the property in different
Yeah, you have
configurations here.
space there.
Yeah, we have.
Just
We have
don't put it
space.
in your backyard.
No, don't worry. No, I know better. I do know better. So anyway, so I think that is the fact that there's this testing strategy, and that humans can, I think you want to press gently on that scale to see how it goes.
Yeah.
And so I think, we, as it's been said frequently, humans have been responsible for the decline that we have fomented, and now we have a chance. It falls to us to actually be able to do the things that protect redwoods and other trees as well.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting. We get, as you can imagine, all kinds of conflicting scientific counsel, different studies, arguing different things. And the region in which we work in the Santa Cruz Mountains is towards the southern end of the range of the species. And it is already drier and warmer than up north. And so we've heard different arguments from different scientists about whether our trees where we work may have already been selecting for this kind of, and may already be more able to survive the impacts of climate change than those up north, because they've already been under duress through their lifetime, prior to climate change. So it's interesting. It's a reminder of how little we actually truly know about some of these species.
Yeah, and there have been some interesting studies done, and there's obviously a lush literature now on the tree. But, for instance, we've already seen it in the ability of Xylopsora canopiorum, which is a fungi that is succeeding, or lichen that succeeded in growing in drier climates. And so that's a fairly exciting finding, that some of these, the commensals, the commensals as they're called, all the species that rely on the tree,
Yeah.
and that the tree relies on, can do well in different climates, because of course it's not ever just about the tree. It's about its ecosystem. It's about its partners, that are above and below and around and within it. And so if we can help them survive, I think that's a handle into helping the tree survive as well.
I thought I knew a lot about redwoods, and then we started this webinar series, and we've brought on lichenologists and mycologists, and things that I was aware of. But boy, it is so clear that the tapestry is so much more complicated than we understood, and that just this concept of assisted migration, that we're just going to up and plant a few redwoods somewhere else and it's all going to be fine, is just folly. Right. So right. Anyway, it's interesting. Do you feel, having looked at all, not just redwoods, all the species you're looking at, do you feel more or less heartened by how these trees and associated forests are going to survive climate change, or whether they will? What's sort of your general mood, having gone deep on 12 different trees across the world?
I feel good, I've got to say, about them. I think it's safe to say that none of my 12 trees really are in decline. I mean, if you look at them historically, they've been in decline, but if you kind of are looking at the present moment, I think all of them are doing quite well. And in fact, one of them, the Toromiro, Sophora Toromiro, which is the lost tree of Easter Island, which they've not been able to get to grow there. It's an expat that has now existed in botanic gardens around the world for 60 years, but it was extirpated on Easter Island, Rapa
Yeah,
Nui, sometime around 1960 or 61 or 62. And so, but they're moving forward, trying to get that to grow on the island as well. So I think either things are holding steady or making slow advance. And then, of course, some of them are wildly abundant, like the eucalyptus tree,
yeah.
which is a tree that people often love to hate. And I have different opinions about that.
Well, I was gonna
So,
say, I'm of course grilling you about redwoods because that's our jam here at Semper
mhm,
Virens, but
yeah.
maybe give the audience a little bit of a flavor of what are some of the other trees that are in the book and what are some of your, I know, I'm assuming redwoods are one of your favorites, but what are
Absolutely.
some
And
of
let me
the
just
other
say,
interesting tree species that they could learn about by reading your book?
let me just say it up front. And you'd think I'd be able to rattle off all 12, and I don't have to consult the index of the book to do it every time. But so I'll just take you through the 12 trees. So there's the bristlecone pine, which leads off the book, the coast redwood, the Sophora toromira, the tree from Easter Island I mentioned, a tree known only from the fossil record, Hymenea protera, which is really a story about the amber and the things found in amber. The longleaf pine, a great pyrophilic story about how trees need fire and how we've messed that up. The East Indian sandalwood tree, the Central African forest ebony tree, the blue gum eucalyptus, the olive tree, Olea europaea, the African baobab, the bald cypress in the American South, and then finally the ceiba tree, the Ceiba pentandra, which is the biggest tree on the South American continent. And in some ways, an interesting cognate to the coast redwood because of its immense size and its immense sort of presence in the landscape.
So
So,
having
yeah.
looked at all of these, were there any that you felt particularly drawn to or connected to?
Well, the coast redwood was one of my. In fact, that was the first chapter of
You
the
don't
book.
have to say
No,
that.
no. Well, let me tell you a little story about that, though. I know I don't have to say that, but it was the first chapter in the book until my editor looked at the bristlecone pine chapter. He said, "You need to make that the first chapter of the book because of the way your story progressed." And I said, "Fine."
Well,
So that's
those
where the
are
red.
pretty cool trees.
Yeah, they are pretty cool trees, and they're also Western. They do share that with the coast redwood that they're a longtime resident of Western North America. I
And
suppose,
also supremely long-lived.
yeah, 5,000 plus years now we know.
They
So
they make the redwoods look like, punks.
like pikers, yeah, no, it's hard to say that about a redwood, but in terms of my connections, probably the ceiba tree in South America.
Yeah.
Partly because really it's personal because it's a part of the world I've had a particular affinity to. My PhD's in Latin American history. I've spent a lot of time in South America and Central America. And it's also one of those trees that is being protected in a different kind of way in that people want to keep people away from it. And I
Yeah.
think there's a sort of idea about a biological preserve, even though these trees are widely scattered. And I think that's a really useful way to think about some of these trees, is just to leave them alone.
You know, so much of this book and so much of just uh, the viability of biodiversity these days is about the human interaction, positive or negative, with
Yeah.
these natural communities. And I'm curious whether you have some interesting observations to share about um, human communities that are particularly connected to one of these species.
It varies.
Either
I think,
either in their
yeah,
destruction or their preservation or a bit of both. In the case of the redwoods, I
yeah.
could tell you stories about both.
It's hard to generalize, Sarah, because I think each species, and in fact each tree perhaps even warrants perhaps different kinds of responses. So some trees are hard to leave alone. So if you think about the olive tree,
Yeah, of course.
we can't really leave it alone in that we're now addicted to olives and olive oil. You
Yeah.
know, so that is a tree you can't really leave alone, but you still have to have an eye towards its preservation, its care, the numerous threats that come at it from the insect world
Yeah.
and from the fungal world. And then there's some that really, deserve to be left alone. And in the Coast Redwood chapter, I talk a lot about the rights of nature and how, trees just need to be allowed to be trees without a desire on our part to monetize them or to, productize them or commercialize them in some way. And I think that's a hard concept for us to get along in this sort of our late capitalist society to try to get along with that idea. But I think it's really important, as a way to think about trees. I think it really helps to think about them having their own rights and being allowed to have their own presence without having to serve our particular needs. And that's a difficult concept for people, but I think it's an important one.
It's a really important concept, the inherent sort of right to exist. And yet I spent my early career working on at the federal level here in this country on endangered species protection. And so
Uh-huh.
the endangered species list, that concept, and there's an international analog that you and I were talking about earlier, sort of is based on the idea of the inherent right to exist. And yet, even in that context, always the decision making, at least in this country, is, considering the cost benefit analysis of allowing a particular endangered species, tree or otherwise, to be destroyed because it's, getting in the way of something that humans want.
Yeah.
And it has been really hard, even in a country as wealthy as ours, to see species granted the right to just exist. And I'm curious, have you seen it happen elsewhere, anywhere? Or is this an ambition for us to work towards?
Well, one of the things that's happened, usually those rights of nature things tend to happen in broader context. So, people want to write things into, national constitutions that say, the following rights, trees, the
Yeah,
natural world has its own rights. And so it's not that they reference particular
no,
taxa
right,
or any one particular taxon, but it's really meant to be a kind of a broad umbrella, which is what you'd want, because it would be a
right,
mess to say, well, this tree has rights, but this one doesn't really.
right.
This body of water has rights, but this body of water not really. So you want to have a blanket thing that does that, and I think some of these seem to be succeeding. It's very there are many complexities to this
Yeah, because then what does
idea.
that, if it's at a macro level that you make such a statement, which I support,
Mhm.
what does that translate into on a day-to-day basis for any person, landowner, government, making a decision about what activities to allow and what not?
Right. It's also true that it's also true that people don't agree on what it is that is the best course of action.
Yeah,
To do just the thing that it purports to do. And I think that's one of the difficulties is one group might say, well, here's what you need to do to really protect the trees. Well, no, that's not the right thing to do. You need to do the following things. And so, those become contentious issues, but we have to start with a broad framework and then try to fill in and
yeah.
respond to particulars, I think is really the way to think about that
Yeah,
idea.
in our world, in the redwood world, one of the big issues is an increased understanding and argument from some in the science community, and Sempervirens has taken this position that active forest management is going to be needed to support these forests in surviving climate change. And
Right.
in particular, the forests have gotten so out of whack in terms of the fire regime that without purposeful reintroduction of low severity fire and all the things you need to do to allow that to happen, these trees are just going to suffer in some catastrophic fire.
Yeah.
And that's a controversial idea for an organization like ours to be supporting
Mm,
thinning of some of the forests
yeah.
to make them less prone to catastrophic wildfire. And I am sympathetic to the people who say, look, humans since time immemorial have thought they knew how to manage these trees and have not always gotten it right. And you
Yeah.
need to be approached with humility. But I think in this era of climate change, humility can't also equal inaction.
Yeah.
And yet it's understandably, people see, there are other people who see it differently, and that's legitimate, and it's complicated.
It really is. I think this idea of prescribed burning is a really important one in the American West because there are various reasons it's a complication for us. In a way, it's not a complication on the East Coast, for instance. But
Yeah,
they've developed. I went on a prescribed burn among the longleaf pine, which is a story I tell in the chapter on that tree. But
yeah,
they're very sophisticated and have very careful plans. We have structural difficulties here in the West that involve a higher payload of flammable material. But you're absolutely right that we have to take some steps to manage the forests. We
yeah,
really do. And I think that if you think about fire as one of the existential threats to trees in the West, then you have to think about ways to make fire less of a threat. And the way to do that, one of the ways, of course, is through prescribed burning. And so we're
Yeah.
behind the curve, but we're working on it. We're working on it, I think it's safe to say.
Yeah, I think it is an existential threat. I've been talking to my staff about it and saying, for sempervirens and other conservation organizations that were born out of the turn of the last century, when there was this sudden recognition that all this unfettered logging could actually lead to the extirpation of this species if we didn't sort of stop and take a breather.
Yeah.
I think that climate change is as much of an existential threat as that sort of unfettered harvesting was a century plus ago. And we
Yeah.
just need to recognize it as such, that it really is that serious a threat, and it requires dramatic rethinking how we look at these forests and how we think about preserving them.
Absolutely agree. Yeah.
So, all right, well, tell me, switching gears a little bit, tell me what you've learned. We talked about this a little bit, but I thought it was throughout the book is there are references to it. Maybe you can share with the audience about some of the interconnectedness between the trees, plants, fungi, lichens, all the other things that we've talked about. You and I talked a bit about bird species as well. And maybe tell us a little bit about how the role that trees play in the larger ecological health of certain landscapes.
I mean, I think
Or
some
what
of
you've learned about it from these 12 species.
I think I have lots to say about this. I'll try to be somewhat succinct and not sloppy about it. But I mean, I think there's some of the things we know well about the benefits of trees, right? I hardly need to itemize them. The fact that they can sequester carbon, the fact that they can reduce erosion, the fact that they, play a cultural and aesthetic role for us, and they lower heat because they reduce the albedo effect from reflected light off the ground. And there are many other benefits to them. But one of the things I learned about this whole interconnectedness of ecosystems of trees is that, research is done in parts, I've discovered. It seems like a silly thing to say because of course it is, but we just don't have the horsepower, as it were, out there to do global overviews of something. So if you're looking at, say, the role, I'm going to give you a very specific example from the book, the role of elephants endangering baobab trees in Africa. You can't study every set of circumstances across the African continent. You can do a study in one particular township or another part of the township. And so, I've come to understand much better that research is done in parts, and that's necessary because there's a lot to study and there's a lot of individual and regional variation that needs to be better understood. And even for something like the redwood, even though it occupies a relatively small, part of the landscape compared to some of these other continental trees, there's still a lot of variation. And so and one of the things I learned from studying several of these trees is that you can use these micro data loggers that can report the conditions on individual trees, how much water it's receiving, and so and other kind of metrics that track, what individual trees are going through, and so I think that helps us understand variation. And maybe it's paradoxical to say understanding variation helps you understand interconnectedness, but it does, because it's all about ecological health and ecological survival. So I think, it's also, I'll just say in a broad way, it's shocking how interconnected these trees are to other parts of the environment and to other trees. In fact, we know that trees can communicate with each other. We know that from Suzanne Simard's book on finding the mother tree.
She was one of our first interviews.
I saw that. I was delighted to see that. Yeah.
It was great and fascinating and eye-opening. Audience, if you didn't see that one, go check it out. She's amazing.
Yeah,
really.
She gave a talk. Yeah, she gave a Huntington talk too last year, I think it was. Yeah, she's amazing, and she's actually mentioned in an episode of Ted Lasso. I don't know if you caught that.
No, that's hilarious. But for the audience who may not know what we're talking about, one of the things I learned from her is, she has this working theory with some data to support it that different trees are communicating with each other through their roots, through chemical signals, that they've got a host of fungus that they're sharing with each other, and the concept that some of the older individual trees can be really the almost like a maternal figure caring for some of the other trees, including trees of other species, is pretty out there concepts from when I went to graduate school and studied conservation.
Yeah. It's pretty amazing, and now it's a well established idea. In fact, Richard Powers' book, The Overstory, actually draws on, he fictionalizes her in one of the chapters and throughout the book. In fact, the single greatest compliment I've received about my book so far is someone in one of the reviews on Amazon or Goodreads or something said, "This was the book that I'd hoped that The Overstory would be," which is one of the greatest things I've ever read. So,
that is a compliment.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to get him on the webinar.
Yeah, I think he's hard. I want to interrogate him for my next book project. I think he's very reclusive.
Yeah, well, I imagine he has a lot of people
Yeah,
calling on his time.
I think so.
Well, one of the things I thought you did extraordinarily well that I don't think as many others have done is you really tap into some of the historical components. Now, maybe that's your background, maybe it was something about trees that led you to look back, but in order to also look forward. I'm curious how and why you took that approach, and what you felt like it brought to the discussion. So many books that I read today that are about conservation are, here's the moment in time. Maybe they talk about a bit about how we got to a point of a species be in jeopardy, but most of it's here's the here and now, and here's what's going forward. I thought it was fantastic to have some of this context. So can you talk a little bit about why you took that approach?
Yeah, so I mean, in some ways it's baked into my being because I'm trained as a historian. And so, I mean, and everything has a history right up to the present day, and it informs and it shapes not just the present, but of course the future. And no one said it better than one of the characters in, I think it was in Hamlet, or maybe it was Macbeth, one of the Shakespearean plays. He said, "What's past is prologue."
Yeah.
We can't, we have to have a coherent understanding of, well, not just what we've done, but how we've done it, and what that's meant for us moving forward. How might we rethink that? How might we reuse that knowledge? Or how we might deviate from those practices of that knowledge to learn things differently or to do things better. And better, of course, is a moving target, And so I think that's a really important part. And everything has a history. And I think it's also just interesting to understand, and it's also kind of horrifying in a way to understand how much the Redwood's been lumbered. How much it's been used to build it. In entire cities because of all of its useful properties. Most of San Francisco, and so I think it's just useful to understand where we've come from. And I'll just as a generalization, there are a lot of particular reasons that's helpful, but it helps us recast things. It helps us avoid mistakes we made before. It helps us, take in an emotional way the scale of the use of trees in particular that we've made, that we've done, that have greatly diminished. I mean, trees didn't just disappear because of neglect or a lack of rainfall. They were actively cut down and turned into product for willing participants in that, and so.
Well, I think the story about Rapa Nui or Easter Island is one of the most profound that in essence, this tree was extirpated for human use is really sobering. I think people still think trees are this infinite resource that will regenerate and it's, sustainable resource to a degree.
I think people still think that, for the uninformed, I think people still think that, well, if it's a common human error to say, if we can see a lot of something, then that's got to be how it is, and I think I've got a line in the book. It must be fine. Yeah, I've got a line in the book that say the placards in a neighborhood don't necessarily dictate the national temperature of of something, right?
Yeah.
Of an election or something else.
Yeah, right. You're in you are housed, sitting in this amazing cultural research institution. And I'm curious, did you use the resources of the Huntington a great deal when you were doing your research for this book?
To a degree. I mean, it's very much Huntington reflected in that I'm sitting in the middle of a 207-acre botanic garden that gets 1.2 million visitors a year. I mean, it's a very high volume place. And we're world-class botanists here. And so I leaned on a number of them because they know way more about trees. We have one of the world's leading authorities on conifers here, Kathy Musial, who wrote a 2-volume account of conifers of the world. And that was very helpful. I've also
She could
discovered
fact check you.
she did fact check me, in fact. And I'm surprised at how well my stuff has held up. I've got to say,
That's
we have everything
good.
from plant geneticists to people who work in cryobotany to, people with, it's just an amazing, I think there are probably 20 curators in the botanical staff here, but I've learned you can't just say, here, will you read this chapter of my book? People are busy. So, and then I learned I'd give them like a paragraph at a time. What do you think of that? Have I said this in the right context? And so they were very helpful. But the other thing about being here is that I could walk right up to these trees and have my own experiences with them. And the other thing I want to say about being at the Huntington, even though, so we're also a library, and and trees are like books in very substantial ways, right? They can be read, they can be browsed, they can be scrutinized closely. They have chronologies, they tell stories, they're inspirational to people.
They can't be checked out.
They can't be checked up, and neither can our books, because we're a research library. You can't walk out of the door with one of our books. You have to use it here on site. So analogous to that. And so you can read a tree in so many ways, right?
Yeah.
And the bark is like a binding, and then the inner part of the innards of the tree are like the pages of a book. There's a whole dendrochronological story to the fact that you can sort of work your way forward page by page / ring by ring to
Yeah.
get to the end of the story or the beginning of the story, depending on the direction you're going, And so I like the book. I think the book analogy works pretty well. And it's certainly the case that, my bookish life here has inflected my tree life because I find common ground between the two,
How how has the book been received both by your colleagues at the Huntington, but also, so we're here uh based outside of Silicon Valley, tremendous technological area,
Mhm.
tremendous technological resource, a lot of very high education level, and you've
Mhm.
got a group of people who are very interested in trees who are going to read this book. But I
Yeah.
wonder, as you took the story of this book to some of these other regions around the world where it may not be the same audience, or maybe you have an audience that's just much more connected to these tree species than people here in Silicon Valley are. I'm just curious what the reaction has been um, to the
You-
book,
It's
and how
yeah.
people see their communities in the book.
It's been incredibly positive, I've got to say. Sorry, my watch is talking to me. It's been incredibly positive, and that's been very gratifying. And I keep waiting for. I'm sort of in this crouch, waiting for a really harsh review of it, but it hasn't. People have really great things to say about it. I will say that what they really love are their local trees, and so I
Yeah,
did this. I did this interview on an Australian drive time radio station a couple weeks ago, and they're interested in the eucalyptus tree. And I opened the book, as it turns out. The very first thing I say is about this the forest in Melbourne, Australia, these city trees that were ailing, and so they assign email addresses, or tree mail, as I call it, to these individual trees, so that people could write in and say, this tree is in decline, and they could geolocate it quickly and figure out what it was and what it needed or where it was. Turns out people wrote love letters to these trees. You're a
oh
very
my
attractive
gosh.
tree. What do I do with my life? These sorts of very big existential questions. And so people are interested in the localities of things, I find. But I think everyone knows a tree. I think there is also something universal about trees that I think appeals to people everywhere, in that everyone knows what a tree is. Everyone has some experience with one, whether it's, as I say in the book, whether it's one you climb down out of a window, whether it's one you help cut down, whether it's one that's graced your sort of the landscape you're surrounded by. So I think it's easy to identify trees, as opposed to writing a book about, say, I don't know, beetles,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
something that people know, but they don't really have that much direct sort of sensory relations with, I suppose.
I found that many of the tree species that in your book I was familiar with, not all of them.
Mhm, mhm.
And I found it, I don't know, this is going to sound funny, but reassuring almost that there were so many, it felt like so many similarities, so many things I could recognize in other
Mm.
parts of the world, how other people, other communities are interacting with their forests or their trees. Um, it felt very universal, I guess is the word you used. I think that's right.
Yeah.
I actually found that very heartening and heartwarming.
That's nice. You know, in January, I spent 3 weeks in Abu Dhabi in the Middle East in the UAE teaching a class for NYU Abu Dhabi it was on birds and endangered ecosystems. No trees. It was
I was going to
horrifying.
say, there's not that many places in the world, but that's probably
No,
one of them, right? So how did
yeah.
they connect with your book? How did they respond to it?
You know, they appreciated it, you know. But I was there to teach a class and we talked about I think we read a little bit out of the tree book. I think people really, if they're in an area where, even if you're in an area where there aren't trees, you know what trees are. And
Yeah, yeah.
I think you're
Some of
still
that.
drawn towards them because you know what they are. And these were all students from around the world. I had 10 students from 9 different countries. So they
Yeah.
were
Okay.
tree friendly, you know, and
Yeah. Yeah.
tree literate, I suppose. But I was kind of horrified and a little bit depressed by everywhere I looked. There was not a tree to be seen I was on Saadiyat Island, which is where most of Abu Dhabi is located in the UAE, and no trees. And it was really depressing. I'd be hard pressed to have a long stint there. You think about no
Yeah.
trees.
It's hard for me to imagine,
Yeah,
actually. I mean, yeah, it's hard to imagine.
good for
Well,
you.
I'm going to open it up in a moment to my colleague, Matt, who's been monitoring the Q&A. But before we do, you and I had a chance to chat right before we got on, and you mentioned to me you're working on a new book concept, and I wanted to ask you to share it with the audience because I thought it was so cool, and I'm
Okay.
so interested for it.
I'll say a little bit about it. I don't want to say too much about it because it's not been bought by a publisher yet, and so.
Well, tell us what you're
But I
thinking
will.
about these
I'm
days.
delighted. I'm delighted to say something about it. So, and I've got to say, this is the first time I've said this to any public audience. So,
Oh, breaking news.
exactly. So it's about birds and extinction, and I want to just say it's a much less woeful story than it might sound at first blush, and it's really about the long arc of time, memory, the role of time, evolution, and succession, which is a common tree concept. It also is a zoological concept, and how I'm giving people new ways to think about extinction. And in a way, I'm going to kind of recast what it even means to use that term extinction in the lens of birds, about 10 or 15 different birds.
Yeah, although as you know, I think we talked about it earlier today, you could pair birds and trees, I mean, very readily.
I could, you know,
And
and I like
not,
that
it's not always
idea.
a direct corollary, but certainly there's a
I
lot, I
could.
imagine there's a lot coming out of this book that would inform even at some, subterranean level, you're thinking about
Yeah.
the bird.
Well, in the same way that a bird probably snuck into every one of these chapters in the tree book, I think now a tree is going to sneak into every one of my bird chapters. So,
Yeah. Oh, there's a lot of birds in this book. We didn't
yeah.
even talk about, well, let's see if Matt's got questions for you from the
Okay.
audience. If not, I'm going to ask you about muralets. So let me
Okay.
invite Matt to let us know if we've got questions from the audience to share with you.
Thank you so much. This has been terrific to hear all your perspectives on how trees are intersecting with climate change. It's been great. We had a question about the next generation and what progress might be made or what might be needed to help children and maybe emerging historians relate to and respect protecting trees and the environment. Are you seeing anything that in your travels that has been interesting in that regard?
I couldn't have probably primed a better question from an audience member than that, because one of the things in this book I have is an afterword called "In Praise of Recording, Reporting, and Remembering." And in some ways, it's an exhortation to the next generation to do just that, to be involved with those 3 tasks: recording, reporting, and remembering. And there's a lot of work to be done by many hands that are not just done in the field, but that are done in research libraries and with study collections, which hold an enormous quantity of material of tree. There's seed banks, and there are specimen collections of virtually every surviving species of tree, and many that are known only from the fossil record. So really, to be involved in the sometimes messy work of the natural world, but not just outside, but in research libraries and other indoor places, will be a great benefit to continue. And there are numbers. We need more shoulders to the wheel to study trees. We need the budget of the Pentagon and a lot of people involved.
Do you feel like, you're teaching young people, right? I mean, do you feel like there's interest and awareness and
I do. I mean, people, one of the things a number of people says I had no idea was their response to reading my book, I had no idea that whatever the particulars are. And so I
Yeah,
think that's an important thing, is to, is to help people understand what trees are, why they're important. And I think writing in a way that reaches the culturally curious, or reaches audiences that are interested in
yeah,
not just the hard science, because people's eyes will roll back in their head if they're
yeah,
not initiated into matters of botany or zoology. You've got to get them, you've got to hook them
yeah,
through other means. And so in some ways, that's one of the goals of this book, is to get people to understand that there are personal, interpersonal, emotional, approaches to understanding trees, that they're things that we all share, these
yeah.
feelings and these ideas.
I think you achieved that.
Thank you. Thanks, Sarah. I appreciate that.
I do too. I wanted to also say that it struck me earlier on when you talked about the elemental sort of categorization that you were considering for the book.
Mhm.
And one of our guests asked if there was an initial question that you were wrestling with that led you to researching trees, or 12 trees.
An initial question. I suppose so. I suppose in a general way it would be, what do people not know about trees? That's pretty broad, but I think that drove a lot of my idea was to reveal things to people that they didn't know, that they thought they might know something about. And so I think there was a discovery component to it that I was excited to try to reveal through the layers of history and research, and present it in a way that people who would be, amateur, would be interested generalist readers that might find something useful. So I wanted to reveal new things, I think, to people, is one way to think about it.
Why trees though? Why not, I don't know, flowers or
That's a,
birds
you know,
or
that's a fair question. I spent a year casting around, at least for this tree book. And, every time you get an idea for a book, someone's already done it. And there are a lot of books about trees out there, and
yeah,
about trees. And so I tried to figure out how to carve a line that people hadn't really taken up. And the other thing I wanted to do is I wanted to give um, some recognition of some of these trees, because some are very well known, like the coast redwood and the Briscoe pine. Some are, there's very little written about them. The Toromiro, there's scientific literature on all these trees, but to find something substantial, like a big meaty chapter of 8,000 or 10,000 words, the African baobab, for instance,
yeah,
the ceiba, you just can't find useful synthetic literature about those trees and their doings. And that was one of my goals, was to bring those things to light. Again, a sort of a reveal of some of these things that people wouldn't have a reason to have been exposed to.
yeah. And that's one of the things that makes the book a joy, I think.
Thank you.
We had a question about the human interconnectedness with trees, in particular, whether you reflect at all with any of the tree species and their indigenous communities and their relationships with trees. Amongst the redwoods, we often think about prescribed fire and traditional prescribed or cultural burning of trees. Was there anything in your research that unearthed a new idea or something unexpected about indigenous practices?
There's been quite a lot written about that, and one of the things I found really interesting was the story of, I'm actually going to give me a second to find it, because I want to be able to quote from it with some specificity. Yeah, so the story about sequoia, which maybe if you're a fan of the sequoia, the genesis of that term. And there's an indigenous term to the name sequoia, which I found really interesting, and it's thought to have come from a Cherokee, named Sequoia, who was a man of high linguistic talent, who created this official, again, a bookish tie, an official and effective writing system, right? Which is a really rare event for pre-literate people. And he created what he called the syllabary, which is a set of written symbols, because he'd seen soldiers, writing or reading paper, and he called this talking leaves. And so he determined to make his own syllable-based language. And so it's durable and successful up to the present day. And so that's one of the things I love about that it's relevant to the genus, Sequoia, but it also, resonates with the sempervirens, ever living, And so, and I do talk somewhat. One of the problems with writing a book about 12 trees is that you only have so much space to fall down a rabbit hole. And I could have centered the tree around native practices easily. There's a great deal to be said about that, and I, in a way, had to keep moving. So I touch upon it, but I don't really give it its proper due in this book, because I can't really, in some ways, for any of the trees. So that was one. The other one is the ceiba, which I found a really interesting native story. One of the things they do is they bless the tree whenever they leave its presence. They really think of it as an entity in the forest, and that I found that fascinating and very touching. One of the trees we visited probably was never visited by someone outside of native communities before. It was very far trek to get to this tree inland, off of a very remote river. We were very far away from civilization, and so I found it very touching that they have their own relationships to these trees, and they have made a point of finding them and bearing witness to them in some significant ways.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing. I can imagine there's a lot to explore out there, and you had some choices to make. There's been a bit of talk about helping trees, in particular redwoods, migrate, find new places to thrive in the face of climate change. Did you come across any research about natural adaptations or strategies that tree populations might be using to cope with climate change?
I did. I mean, one of the things that has happened, there's been both intentional and unintentional relocation of trees that's let us kind of test the outer limits of its range. This happens in certainly with the coast redwood, where people have tried to test by just very slowly dosing. It's like dosing a patient with a medicine in a way, by very incrementally moving it to a drier part of the range and seeing how it does. Of course, that takes time, right? And so the other thing to do, censusing trees becomes very important. And so to understand, to understand where every single tree is a boon, because then you can really examine them to see how far. You can use geospatial data, you can use GIS systems to track all the trees, and then have data that underlies it that says how tall they are, how healthy they are, what their root structures are like, and really where they're located, and imprints it sort of geographically onto a map that you can make sense of. There was something else I was going to say about that. Say your question again, Matt. the person's question again.
Yes, sorry. Wondering if you came across any natural adaptations or strategies that tree populations were using to cope with climate change.
Right. So I gave an example of a human caused one, but there are also ways that we can take advantage of natural distribution. So in some cases, with some of these trees, seeds are eaten by animals, and then they're dispersed naturally. An animal poops up high on a ridge where a tree doesn't normally grow. Is it growing there? Yes, it often it is, because you can see its presence, and you can sort of assess how it's doing in those different climates where it normally isn't distributed. And so, I mean, trees do travel, and there are reasons that trees travel. They're brought about by all the things that interact with the tree, animals that, things that are distributed by the wind, or through water, or through animals that carry them and drop them in odd locations. And it's often not just about their range, but about their elevation. And that's the other vector. Is it's not just latitude and longitude, it's elevation. And so something that might not grow at a lower elevation might be found to do well at a higher elevation, for instance. And so because there's so many complexities in the sort of vector, in the things that dictate why something and where something will survive. I don't know how satisfying an answer that is, but there you have it.
Well, I think we're going to have to wrap up on that note. But Dan, thank you. This has been really, I was going to say fun. It has been fun, but it's been thought-provoking. The book is thought-provoking. Again, it's in the chat, but for those of you who are visual, this is the book, 12 Trees. I really encourage you to check it out. And if you are successful in getting your bird book done, we will invite you back to talk about what you've learned about birds. And it would be delightful if there was one in our region, but even if there isn't, we would be delighted to speak with you.
I'll keep that in mind.
Yes, so thank you. And
Yeah.
we encourage people to go check out the Huntington. It's really a remarkable resource. and open to the public, correct? You need to
We're
get
open to the public. We're open every day except Tuesday. We're open from 10 to 5. And if you're there, give me a shout. If I can't, I'll run out and say hi. You know,
That would be great.
It's a wonderful,
Um,
amazing place if you've never been here.
Yeah, I highly recommend that to people as well. And to our audience, thanks for joining us. We will be back next month, as I said, with Dr. Suzanne Bartlett-Hackenmiller. She has just signed on as Semperviron's wellness advisor. I'm so excited about that. And she is helping us and many others think about how nature can be part of caring for our health and well-being, physical and emotional and mental. All those things are kind of one and the same. Rather than separate, but she will be here to talk about a new park prescription program that we have been designing with her support to try to help make the trails in our region more accessible to people who are looking at them as a way of improving their health. So join us for that. And thank you again to Shepherd Mullen for sponsoring this particular installment of Under the Redwoods, and of course to Scharf Investments for their ongoing underwriting of this series. So thank you all, and we'll see you under the Redwoods. And thank you, Dan.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you all.
All right, bye-bye.
Okay, bye.